The February Revolution of 1917 was not a sudden event that burst out of nowhere, but the result of decades of simmering discontent and deep-rooted frustrations within Russian society. At its core, it was a movement driven by ordinary people who had grown weary of the endless hardships inflicted upon them by an outdated monarchy and a failing imperial system. Russia, in the early 20th century, was a land of contradictions. A vast empire straddling Europe and Asia, rich in natural resources and manpower, yet shackled by backward governance and a social structure that had not kept pace with the modern world. Tsar Nicholas II ruled as an autocrat, clinging to centuries-old traditions of absolute power. But his reign coincided with a time when people across the globe were demanding reform, representation, and a voice in how they were governed. The Russian people were no different, and the gulf between ruler and ruled was growing dangerously wide. Life for the average Russian was marked by poverty, hunger, and constant struggle. Despite Russia's rapid industrialization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the benefits were not shared evenly. A small elite closely tied to the monarchy and the aristocracy enjoyed immense wealth, while peasants who made up the majority of the population lived in conditions that had changed little since serfdom was abolished in 1861. The working class in urban centers like Petrograd and Moscow faced long hours, low wages, and hazardous conditions in factories. Strikes and labor unrest had already been common before 1917, and revolutionary groups had been quietly sowing seeds of dissent for years. The Social Democrats split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and the Socialist revolutionaries all gained traction among workers and peasants, who saw little future under the existing system. Yet, despite this growing unrest, Nicholas II remained blind to the storm that was gathering around him. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 intensified every problem Russia faced. Initially, there was a wave of patriotic enthusiasm, with many rallying behind the Tsar in defense of the motherland. However, this spirit quickly evaporated as the war dragged on and the scale of suffering became clear. Russia's poorly equipped army endured catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, and millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Supplies of weapons, boots, and even food were woefully inadequate, and morale among the troops plummeted. Soldiers often went into battle without rifles, instructed to pick up the weapons of their fallen comrades. The incompetence of Russia's military leadership was glaring, and Nicholas II's decision to personally take command of the army in 1915 only made matters worse. His absence from the capital left the government in the hands of his unpopular wife, Tsarina Alexandra, whose reliance on the mystic Rasputin further discredited the monarchy. By the winter of 1916-1917, Russia was a nation exhausted by war, plagued by shortages, and ready to explode. Food scarcity became the most immediate and pressing problem for ordinary Russians. The war effort consumed vast amounts of grain and other resources, while transportation networks broke down under the strain. Long bread lines became a common sight in Petrograd, where bitterly cold winters made waiting in them even more unbearable. Inflation eroded the value of wages, leaving families unable to afford basic necessities. The frustration among the urban poor was compounded by the perception that the wealthy were insulated from these hardships. Fueling resentment against the ruling class, strikes grew more frequent, and slogans calling for peace, land, and bread echoed through the streets. By February 1917, Petrograd was a powder keg, and only a spark was needed to ignite the revolution. That spark came in the form of International Women's Day on February 23rd, March 8th, in the modern calendar. What began as a demonstration of women demanding bread and better working conditions quickly swelled into a mass protest involving tens of thousands of workers. They marched through the streets of Petrograd, chanting slogans against the Tsar and calling for an end to the war. The demonstrations spread rapidly, and within days, virtually the entire city was paralyzed by strikes. Factories shut down, transportation ground to a halt, and the capital became engulfed in chaos. Attempts by the authorities to restore order failed, as police forces proved inadequate to control the sheer size of the crowds. The situation escalated further when the soldiers, many of whom were conscripts from peasant backgrounds, began to sympathize with the demonstrators. Instead of firing on the crowds as ordered, entire regiments mutinied, and joined the protests, handing over weapons to the people and tipping the balance of power irreversibly. The collapse of loyalty among the armed forces was the fatal blow to Nicholas II's regime. For centuries, the monarchy had relied on the army to enforce its authority. But once the soldiers switched sides, the Tsar's power evaporated. Petrograd fell completely into the hands of revolutionaries and mutineers, and the Duma, Russia's legislative body, seized the opportunity to take charge. Though the Tsar attempted to suppress the uprising by issuing orders from his military headquarters, events were moving too quickly. Railways were blocked, communications disrupted, and his decrees ignored. Trapped by circumstances, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate on March 2, 1917. His abdication marked the end of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, and with it, the end of the Russian Empire as it had existed. The February Revolution was remarkable not only for its rapid success, but also for its largely spontaneous character. Unlike the later October Revolution, which was carefully orchestrated by the Bolsheviks, the February uprising was driven by the collective desperation of ordinary people rather than a centralized political plan. Workers, women, and soldiers together toppled a monarchy that had seemed immovable just weeks earlier. The revolution was as much a social earthquake as a political one, reflecting the collapse of faith in the Tsarist system and the demand for something new to replace it. Yet, while it ended autocracy, it did not resolve Russia's deeper problems. The provisional government that took power was immediately confronted with the monumental task of governing a country in chaos. Still embroiled in a world war and facing demands for radical reforms from its people, what was clear, however, was that Russia could never return to its old ways. The February Revolution had permanently altered the course of its history. The fall of the Romanov dynasty in February 1917 created a vacuum of power at the very heart of Russia. And into this void stepped the provisional government. Its establishment was not the result of careful planning, but rather a hurried response to the immediate crisis. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, the authority of the monarchy collapsed overnight. And the State Duma, which had long been sidelined and stripped of power under the autocracy, suddenly found itself thrust into a leadership role. From within the Duma emerged a group of moderate and liberal politicians who sought to stabilize the country and provide a new direction after centuries of imperial rule. They formed what came to be known as the Provisional Government. With Prince Georgy Lvov initially serving as its head, this body was envisioned as a temporary caretaker that would govern until a democratically elected constituent assembly could determine Russia's future. On paper, it represented a significant break from autocracy, promising political freedom, civil liberties, and a path toward democracy. In reality, however, it inherited an almost impossible situation, beset on all sides by war, economic collapse, and revolutionary fervor. One of the central problems the provisional government faced was legitimacy. While it claimed authority as the successor to the monarchy, it was not chosen by the people. Its leaders were largely drawn from Russia's liberal elite. Men who had sat in the Duma and believed in constitutionalism, reform, and the gradual modernization of the empire. They envisioned a parliamentary democracy similar to those in Western Europe. However, in the eyes of the workers, peasants, and soldiers who had driven the February Revolution, these figures seemed distant and disconnected from their everyday struggles. Parallel to the provisional government, another power center emerged in Petrograd, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This body, made up of delegates directly elected from factories and military units, wielded enormous influence over the capital and beyond. The result was a situation historians have often called dual power, where the provisional government had formal authority but the Soviet commanded real loyalty from the masses. This uneasy balance would define Russian politics for the months that followed. The war was the greatest immediate test for the provisional government. Russia had already endured 3 years of devastating losses in the First World War, and the people were exhausted by the conflict. The February Revolution had been fueled in large part by demands for peace, yet the new government chose to continue fighting alongside the Allies. Many of its leaders feared that abandoning the war effort would dishonor Russia's commitments to Britain and France, undermine its international standing, and risk territorial concessions to Germany. In their view, peace could only come after a decisive victory. This decision proved disastrous. The army was in no condition to continue fighting. Morale among soldiers was at rock bottom, and desertions were becoming widespread. In June 1917, the provisional government launched the so-called Kerensky Offensive, named after Alexander Kerensky, a charismatic figure who had become Minister of War and later Prime Minister. The offensive collapsed almost immediately, with Russian troops refusing to fight and in some cases retreating without firing a shot. Instead of boosting morale, it deepened disillusionment with the government, feeding the perception that it was out of touch and unwilling to deliver what the people demanded most: an end to the war at home. The provisional government also struggled with the urgent social and economic issues that had brought people into the streets during the February Revolution. Chief among these was the land question. For centuries, Russian peasants had longed for redistribution of land from the wealthy aristocracy to those who actually worked the soil. The February Revolution had raised hopes that such a reform might finally come, yet the provisional government, made up of cautious liberals and fearing chaos in the countryside, delayed meaningful action, insisting that land reform must wait until the Constituent Assembly convened. This hesitation infuriated peasants, who began seizing land from landlords on their own, often with violent consequences. Each passing month without reform further eroded the government's credibility in rural areas, which made up the majority of Russia's population. Urban centers presented another challenge. Workers in Petrograd and Moscow expected not only better wages and shorter hours, but also greater control over their workplaces. Factory committees sprang up, demanding a voice in management decisions, and in some cases, taking over production themselves. The provisional government, however, worried that such radical measures would destabilize the economy and resisted empowering these committees. Inflation continued to spiral, food shortages grew worse, and strikes became increasingly common. For the workers who had helped overthrow the Tsar, the new government seemed little different from the old regime, more concerned with maintaining order and appeasing elites than addressing the daily struggle for bread and dignity. The gap between expectation and reality widened dangerously. Politically, the provisional government was hamstrung by its own divisions and indecision. Prince Lvov, though well-meaning, proved ineffective in handling the mounting crises. And in July 1917, he resigned, handing leadership to Kerensky. Kerensky was young, energetic, and gifted with oratory, and for a time he inspired hope that he might save the revolution. Yet he too faced the same insurmountable obstacles. Compounded by the fact that Russia was now a nation awash in revolutionary ideas, across the country, radical voices grew louder, none more so than the Bolsheviks under Lenin. Having returned from exile in April, Lenin issued his famous April Theses, rejecting any compromise with the provisional government and calling for all power to the Soviets. His message resonated powerfully with workers and soldiers who had lost patience with the slow pace of reform and the continued prosecution of the war. While the government denounced the Bolsheviks as extremists, their popularity grew rapidly as they presented themselves as the true champions of the revolution's promises. The summer of 1917 saw repeated challenges to the provisional government's fragile authority. The July days, a series of armed demonstrations by workers and soldiers in Petrograd, revealed the depth of anger against the government, but also exposed divisions among the revolutionary movement. Although the government managed to suppress the unrest with force, arresting Bolshevik leaders and briefly restoring a semblance of order, its reliance on repression only further alienated the masses. Later in August, General Vladimir Kornilov attempted a right-wing coup, marching troops toward Petrograd with the intention of restoring order and crushing radical elements. Kerensky, fearing dictatorship, turned to the very Bolsheviks he had suppressed for help in defending the capital. The Bolsheviks mobilized workers and soldiers to resist Kornilov, and though the coup collapsed without a major battle, the episode shattered what little confidence remained in the provisional government. It demonstrated both its weakness and its dependence on revolutionary forces it could not control. As the months wore on, the authority of the provisional government disintegrated. Its failure to resolve the war, deliver land reform, or address economic collapse meant that it alienated nearly every major social group in Russia. Peasants saw it as an obstacle to land redistribution. Workers viewed it as indifferent to their struggles. and soldiers considered it responsible for prolonging a senseless and bloody conflict. Meanwhile, the Soviets, especially in Petrograd, grew in power and influence, with Bolsheviks steadily gaining majorities within them. By the autumn of 1917, the provisional government was essentially governing in name only. With its decrees ignored and its authority openly challenged, the dual power system had given way to a situation where real power was slipping into the hands of those who promised radical change. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were waiting for the right moment to act, and the failures of the provisional government ensured that when they did, much of the population would be ready to support them. The October Revolution of 1917, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution, was one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, not just for Russia, but for the entire world. By the time autumn arrived, the Russian provisional government had all but exhausted its credibility, its authority reduced to fragile scraps in a country seething with discontent. Its continuation of the war, refusal to implement land reform, and inability to solve food shortages alienated peasants, workers, and soldiers alike. Meanwhile, the Soviets' councils of workers' and soldiers' deputies were growing in power and influence, particularly in Petrograd and Moscow. Within these Soviets, the Bolsheviks steadily increased their representation, fueled by a tireless campaign of agitation, propaganda, and promises that spoke directly to the immediate needs of the people. Their slogans, peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets, encapsulated everything the masses longed for and contrasted sharply with the indecisive and ineffectual policies of the provisional government. It was within this atmosphere of frustration and radicalization that Lenin and his party prepared to seize power. Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917 had transformed the revolutionary landscape, arriving at the Finland station in Petrograd after years of exile. He wasted no time in denouncing the provisional government and urging his fellow Bolsheviks to reject any cooperation with it. His April theses laid out a clear strategy. Russia must withdraw immediately from the imperialist war. Land must be redistributed to the peasants without compensation to landlords, and political power must be transferred to the Soviets. At the time, even some within the Bolshevik party considered his demands too extreme. But Lenin's clarity of vision and refusal to compromise ultimately gave the party a distinct identity that resonated with growing sections of the population. Throughout the spring and summer, Bolshevik newspapers, leaflets, and speakers spread their message tirelessly in factories, barracks, and villages, building momentum for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The July days had demonstrated both the potential and the risks of revolutionary action. When mass demonstrations erupted in Petrograd, demanding the Soviets take power, the Bolsheviks found themselves both bolstered by popular support and vulnerable to government repression. The provisional government accused them of attempting an armed insurrection, arrested their leaders, and forced Lenin into hiding in Finland. For a time, it seemed the Bolsheviks might have overplayed their hand, yet the government's own weakness quickly reversed the tide. The Kornilov affair in August, when General Kornilov attempted to march on Petrograd and establish military dictatorship, exposed just how fragile Kerensky's government had become. In desperation, Kerensky called on the Bolsheviks and their supporters to help defend the capital. Armed workers and Red Guards mobilized under Bolshevik influence, successfully blocking Kornilov's forces. In the process, the Bolsheviks rehabilitated their reputation, emerging as defenders of the revolution. Their popularity soared, and by September, they had secured majorities in both the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, giving them an institutional base of power. The Bolsheviks were no longer a marginal faction, but a formidable force with tens of thousands of committed activists and the backing of armed workers and soldiers. Lenin, still in hiding, pressed relentlessly for immediate insurrection. He believed the provisional government was doomed, and that any delay would risk losing the revolutionary opportunity. Within the Bolshevik leadership, there was debate. Some, like Lev Kamenev and Gregory Zinoviev, feared that seizing power without broad support across Russia would lead to disaster. Others, including Leon Trotsky, who had joined the Bolsheviks that summer, sided with Lenin, arguing that the Soviets now provided a legitimate base from which to claim authority. Trotsky, as chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, played a crucial role in organizing the Military Revolutionary Committee, a body ostensibly created to defend the capital from counter-revolution. but in reality, serving as the seismic mechanism for the Bolshevik seizure of power. The insurrection was carefully planned but executed with remarkable speed and efficiency. On the night of October 24th, November 6th in the modern calendar, Red Guards, soldiers, and sailors loyal to the Bolsheviks began moving through Petrograd, taking control of key points in the city. Bridges, railway stations, telegraph offices, and government buildings were seized with little resistance. The following day, Bolshevik forces converged on the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. Contrary to later Soviet propaganda, the storming of the palace was not a dramatic blood-soaked battle, but rather a relatively low-key affair. The defenders, including a small contingent of military cadets and the women's battalion, offered minimal resistance. By the early hours of October 26, the palace had fallen. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested. Kerensky, the prime minister, had fled earlier in a desperate attempt to rally loyal forces, but found little support. With the fall of the Winter Palace, the provisional government ceased to exist, and the Bolsheviks had taken control of the capital. At the same time, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was meeting in Petrograd. Bolsheviks, now dominant within the Soviets, used the occasion to legitimize their seizure of power. When news of the Winter Palace's fall reached the assembly, Menshevik and socialist revolutionary delegates denounced the coup and walked out in protest. Those who remained overwhelmingly Bolsheviks and their allies voted to transfer authority to the Soviets, effectively ratifying the new regime. Council of People's Commissars was formed, with Lenin as its head. Trotsky declared to the Congress, "Go where you belong from now, into the dustbin of history," addressing the departing moderates. For the Bolsheviks, it was a moment of triumph. The realization of their vision that the Soviets should replace the old state apparatus. The success of the October Revolution can in part be explained by the fact that it encountered so little organized resistance. The provisional government had alienated nearly every sector of society and commanded no real loyalty. The army was in disarray, the police force had disintegrated, and the political moderates lacked both organization and will to oppose the Bolsheviks effectively. Many Russians, exhausted by months of turmoil and years of war, simply accepted the change in power with resignation or cautious optimism. Petrograd itself remained relatively calm, with life in many districts continuing almost as normal, even as history was being made at its center. Yet the seizure of power in the capital was only the beginning. Beyond Petrograd, vast regions of Russia remained uncertain, divided, or outright hostile to Bolshevik rule. For Lenin and his party, the challenge now was to consolidate their fragile hold on power in the face of internal opposition and the looming threat of civil war. Still, the October Revolution marked a decisive break with the past. For the first time, a Marxist party had seized power in a major country, not through parliamentary reform or gradual evolution, but through a direct and uncompromising overthrow of the existing state. The world watched with astonishment as Russia, long considered backward and autocratic, suddenly became the epicenter of a radical experiment in socialism. For supporters, it was the dawn of a new era of workers, power, and liberation from exploitation. For opponents, it was a reckless gamble that threatened to plunge Russia into chaos and inspire upheaval far beyond its borders. The Bolsheviks had promised peace, land, and bread, and by taking power in October 1917, they positioned themselves as the only force willing and able to deliver on those demands. Whether they could fulfill these promises was another matter. But in seizing the moment when their opponents were weak and discredited, they had accomplished what no other faction dared attempt. The October Revolution had placed power firmly in the hands of the Bolsheviks, but their triumph was far from secure. Russia in late 1917 was a vast and unstable empire, racked by war, famine, and political division. The Bolsheviks had overthrown the provisional government, but they inherited a shattered state and a society seething with competing interests. Almost immediately, they faced resistance from rival political parties, disillusioned army officers, regional separatists, and foreign powers determined to prevent the spread of Bolshevism. The promise of peace, land, and bread had won them support, but delivering on those promises in practice proved far more complicated. The early days of Bolshevik rule were marked by bold decrees, but also by improvisation, experimentation, and growing reliance on coercion. Out of this turbulent environment emerged the Russian Civil War, a brutal conflict that would rage for years, devastate the country. and ultimately paved the way for the creation of the Soviet Union. One of the first challenges the Bolsheviks confronted was the question of peace. Their decree on peace had been greeted with enthusiasm by soldiers and workers weary of the endless slaughter of the First World War, yet negotiating peace was anything but simple. Russia's allies in the Entente regarded a separate peace as betrayal, while Germany and Austria-Hungary sought to impose harsh terms on the weakened Russian state. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, forced Russia to surrender vast territories, including Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of the Caucasus. For many Russians, this was a humiliating capitulation, a dismemberment of their country that sparked outrage across the political spectrum. The Bolsheviks justified the treaty as a necessary evil to secure peace and consolidate their revolution. But it gave their enemies a rallying cry and set the stage for armed resistance. Many officers in the former Imperial Army, already hostile to Bolshevik rule, saw Brest-Litovsk as treason and began organizing against the new regime. The land issue was equally explosive. The decree on land had formally abolished private ownership of land, transferring estates to the peasants who worked them. This move legitimized the mass seizures already underway in the countryside, where peasants had been taking over landlords' property since the collapse of Tsarist authority. While the policy won the Bolsheviks enormous popularity among rural communities, it also unleashed chaos. Traditional elites were dispossessed, land distribution was often violent, and agricultural production declined as peasants prioritized subsistence farming over supplying the cities. The Bolsheviks had secured peasant support in the short term, but they soon discovered that the peasantry's vision of land reform ownership and autonomy clashed with their own socialist ideals of collective agriculture and centralized control. This tension would resurface repeatedly in the years to come, feeding rural uprisings and deepening the divisions of the Civil War. In the cities, the situation was no less dire. Workers had placed great hopes in the revolution, expecting immediate improvements in living and working conditions. The Bolsheviks encouraged the formation of workers' committees in factories and implemented policies of workers' control. But Russia's economy was collapsing under the weight of war, strikes, and shortages. Industrial output plummeted, inflation spiraled, and hunger stalked urban populations. To maintain support, the Bolsheviks nationalized major industries and banks, laying the foundation for a planned economy. But the chaos of transition deepened rather than alleviated the crisis. Food requisitioning became essential, with armed detachments sent into the countryside to seize grain for the cities. This policy bred deep resentment among peasants and fueled violent clashes between rural communities and Bolshevik agents. What had begun as a revolution promising freedom and empowerment increasingly relied on force to sustain itself. The political landscape was equally turbulent. The Bolsheviks had promised to convene a constituent assembly, elected by universal suffrage, to decide Russia's future government. Elections were held in late 1917, but the results did not favor the Bolsheviks. The socialist revolutionaries, with their deep support among peasants, won the largest share of seats, while the Bolsheviks secured only about a quarter of the vote. When the Constituent Assembly met in January 1918, the Bolsheviks quickly dissolved it by force, declaring that the Soviets represented the true will of the people. This action confirmed their commitment to one-party rule and alienated many former allies, pushing moderate socialists and liberals into opposition. Political pluralism disappeared as the Bolsheviks banned rival parties, censored the press, and unleashed the Cheka, their newly created secret police to crush dissent. The Red Terror, launched in 1918, was aimed at counter-revolutionary and class enemies, but soon widened to include anyone deemed a threat to Bolshevik authority. Mass arrests, executions, and repression became tools of governance, establishing a pattern that would define Soviet rule for decades. Out of this maelstrom of crisis emerged the Russian Civil War, a conflict that pitted the Bolshevik Red Army against a host of opponents collectively known as the Whites. The Whites were a diverse coalition, including monarchists who sought the restoration of the Tsar, liberals who wanted a democratic republic, nationalists who demanded independence for their regions, and former army officers outraged by Brest-Litovsk. Their lack of unity and competing agendas weakened them, but they were supported by foreign powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. who feared the spread of Bolshevism and wanted to bring Russia back into the war against Germany. Interventionist forces landed in Archangel, Murmansk, and Vladivostok, providing supplies and troops to the White armies. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks built the Red Army under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, who proved to be an exceptional organizer and strategist. By enforcing discipline, reintroducing ranks, and conscripting millions, Trotsky transformed the Red Army into a formidable force capable of defending the revolution. The Civil War was fought on multiple fronts across the vast expanse of Russia. From the frozen north to the steppes of Central Asia, battles were brutal, supply lines tenuous, and atrocities widespread. Entire villages were burned, populations displaced, and famine stalked the land as armies requisitioned food from civilians. Both Reds and Whites engaged in terror, but the Bolsheviks, controlling the central heartland around Petrograd and Moscow, had crucial advantages in resources, communication, and coordination. They portrayed themselves as defenders of the revolution and exploited the disunity of their enemies. While the Whites failed to articulate a vision that could unite peasants and workers, the Bolsheviks' promise of land and peace, however imperfectly delivered, ensured them a base of popular support. By 1921, the Red Army had crushed most White resistance, driving surviving forces into exile and securing Bolshevik control over the former empire. The costs of victory were staggering. Millions died in the Civil War, not only from fighting, but from famine, disease, and displacement. The Russian economy was shattered, with industrial production reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. Cities depopulated as people fled to the countryside in search of food. The famine of 1921-22 claimed millions of lives. Exacerbated by drought and the disruption of agriculture during the war, international aid from organizations like the American Relief Administration helped mitigate the disaster, but the suffering left deep scars. The Bolsheviks responded to the crisis with war communism, a policy of centralized control, requisitioning, and militarization of labor designed to keep the Red Army supplied and maintain their grip on power. While effective in the short term, war communism intensified resentment among peasants and workers, sparking uprisings such as the Tambov Rebellion and the Kronstadt Mutiny. These revolts, though crushed, revealed the growing gap between the Bolsheviks and the very groups they claimed to represent. Out of the chaos of revolution and civil war, a new political order began to take shape. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established. Uniting Russia and several other republics under Bolshevik rule, the Soviet state was built on the foundation of centralized authority, one-party dominance, and the use of repression to eliminate opposition. The ideals of workers' control and popular democracy that had inspired many in 1917 were supplanted by a system in which the Communist Party monopolized power. Yet at the same time, the Soviet Union embodied the revolutionary aspirations of those who believed a new world was being created, one that rejected monarchy, capitalism, and imperialism. To its supporters, the Soviet Union was the vanguard of global revolution, an experiment that could inspire oppressed peoples everywhere. To its enemies, it was a dangerous threat to the established order, a radical regime born of violence and sustained by terror.